All right, welcome everyone. As I mentioned before, you're here for one of our California Advancing PREA office hours. Specifically, today we'll be talking about systems advocacy in detention settings. Like I said, welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I'll go ahead and introduce myself and hand it over to my colleagues in a second here. I'm Marcela Rojas Salas. I'm one of the project managers here at Valor and am joined by my lovely team here from the California Advancing PREA project.
Hi folks, my name is Jenica Sinor. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a project coordinator here at Valor.
Hi everyone, so excited to see y'all. My name is Yamila Cervantes. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a senior program officer at Detention International.
Hi everyone, so nice to see everyone here. My name is Jessica. I'm a senior program director also with Detention International.
And just a reminder, folks can absolutely use the text chat. Let us know if you have any questions or comments or anything around those lines. We will have our PowerPoint available on our website, so that will be there along with our recording. And if folks are chiming in from their phones and they're wanting to mute or unmute themselves, go ahead and use *6 and we'll be able to hear you. A little bit about Valor. We were formerly the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and we're committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. And ultimately, we envision a world free from violence where the dignity of every person is valued and respected.
All right, and then I'll talk a little bit about Just Detention International, or JDI. We are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. Our core goals are to work together with corrections officials and rape crisis centers such as yourselves and policymakers to make detention facilities safer, to change public attitudes about sexual abuse behind bars, and of course to ensure that survivors get the help that they need. No matter what crime a person may have committed, it's our core belief that rape is not part of the penalty. When the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety, and that's really what we're all about. The California Advancing PREA project, which we partner with Valor on, I can't believe it, it's in our 7th year, funded by the California Office of Emergency Services. That has really allowed us to do so much amazing work with rape crisis centers all over the state and with facilities all over the state. The project started just with the prison system, CDCR, but we've been working with county jails and juvenile facilities. And we're here really to provide guidance and support and sometimes crisis intervention or venting to advocates as you all are trying to do this really important work. Our objectives for today is we're gonna talk about systems advocacy and how it's different than individual advocacy. We'll talk about some strategies for building sustainable relationships. And we'll also talk about some key patterns, some common scenarios that we often hear from folks that they struggle with when they're building relationships with detention staff or when they're doing advocacy for on behalf of incarcerated survivors. And just like any of our sessions or our conversations that we have, I want to take a moment just to encourage folks to practice self-care, turn your cameras off if you need to, drink some water, get some stretches in, whatever you need to do, to make sure that you're able to sustain yourself in this work. Super, super crucial.
Cool, thanks, Jessica. So I think we just want to start off by defining what individual advocacy and what systems advocacy is. And for some of you, it might be unfamiliar, but I think for a lot of you, you already are doing this kind of work. So we want to hear from you, and this is where I'm asking for like participation, either by folks unmuting or by typing in the chat, what individual advocacy means. So if folks have ideas, they can just share either way. And I'm going to ask for 3 people to do it for each column. So this is the time, and I won't move on until I hear 3 voices. So, or I see 3 comments in the chat. So feel free to unmute or again, type what you think individual advocacy means.
I think it means to tailor our services so we can fill the needs of our survivors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Phoenix. Other brave souls. I see Concepcion saying, provide trauma-informed services. And Jessica says, supporting people to exercise their rights by providing assistance to voice concerns, access information, resolve issues, or to identify available support options. Cool, thank you. Folks can continue filling in what they think it means. And I do see a lot of other comments as well. So I'm just gonna read those before I sort of share what we thought. But Bree says individual advocacy is letters, hotlines, in-person support during forensic exams and interviews. Bakura shares to listen actively. Priscilla says helping people voice their concerns. Hatsiba says individual could be personalized support about their own needs. Yeah, I feel like y'all hit the nail on the head, right? Like some of the things that we wrote out sort of to create like a baseline definition for us to use as we go through this office hours is individual advocacy often refers to actions that are taken by advocates like yourself that are directly related to an incarcerated person and their day-to-day lives. So this can be something measurable, like folks have mentioned, you know, helping clients obtain information about PREA, about their PREA report, excuse me, or it can be immeasurable. So providing emotional support, discussing coping skills. Often this process is like short-term, so it's not very long and it just focuses on one single client. It usually involves talking to staff who have some sort of like, who are on the front lines or have control over somebody's situation. So some examples of what this can be, again, is like helping people with the housing issues, getting clients proper gender search cards if they're trans clients, filling out paperwork with clients, all those things, and the things that you've already included in the chat fall under individual advocacy. So again, 3 voices. I love to hold the audience hostage. Just kidding, that's not true, but I want to hear from y'all. So what do we think systems advocacy is and how does it maybe differ from individual advocacy? Concepcion's on it. Concepcion says collaboration between other rape crisis centers, community-based organizations, and sharing resources. Yeah, for sure, Concepcion. Raquel Maria, I hope I'm saying your name right. It says policy advocacy for sure. Allison says advocating for change on systems responding to survivors. Yeah. And I'm sorry if you can hear the squeaking. That's just my dog playing with the toy. No, okay, perfect. Systems, Bakura says timely communication between organizations so everyone can be on the same page, creating a less victim blaming work environment. Cool, okay, yeah, again, continue commenting in the chat. Some of the things that we wrote down are that institutional advocacy or systems advocacy refers to actions taken by advocates to change policies, to change procedures that impact incarcerated people in the long term. This kind of advocacy can take a longer time, depending on your desired outcome, and it can impact a lot of participants as well as people who are not your clients or participating in your services or programs at the moment. Institutional advocacy often requires the involvement of people who are in leadership positions who can make greater changes at both the prison or the jail and then at your own agency. And so we have some examples here. So addressing, are you sure you can't hear that squeaking? A little bit? Okay, let me just take one quick moment. Hold on, sorry.
It's all good. And I can take it from here just to give you some time. So some examples of this, folks already mentioned, were collaboration. So this looks like communicating with corrections about confidential mail policies, and not just about ensuring that they have been put into policy, but that they're also being implemented correctly and confidentially. But I'll bring it back to you. Yumila, I didn't think you'd be back so fast.
I just like went and grabbed the toy and I'm like, okay. Anyway, yeah, thank you, Marcela. Yeah, all those things are true. Some of the other examples we listed, you know, are addressing issues related to confidential mail policies, strengthening SART models, using the audit as a tool to ensure that the safety of survivors is being prioritized. And then something we just want to mention, advocacy can seem like a scary word, but just by the fact that you all have a presence at a correctional facility in your service area and meeting with and connecting with program participants and clients who need your support, you're already doing advocacy work. You're changing the culture of the facility, Raquel Maria said, changing social discourse, increasing awareness, decreasing stigma. That's really what we're talking about here. So you're changing the culture at the facility simply by providing services in your service area and connecting with folks who need support. You're also letting people know that good rape crisis services are needed in order to heal from abusive services, regardless of who people are or what they've done. So that's also an important piece of doing advocacy work. And the more that you're able to connect with the facility, the better that you're able to do advocacy work, which requires like a great investment from staff at the facility in your service area. So just one thing to note is that often, advocates find that doing deep individual advocacy work, they also end up doing some systems advocacy in the process as well. So, okay, we want to take a moment to talk a little bit about identifying your team. So I think it's pretty obvious to everyone on the call that a successful partnership is going to yield the best results for your advocacy efforts. And you can't have a successful partnership without identifying who you should be in contact with, who your team is. So it's super likely that you're going to have very many different kinds of partners in your advocacy efforts, and some key partners to just consider to include are the PREA coordinator or PREA compliance manager, depending on which system you're working with, leadership staff, medical and mental health staff at the facility. And then just to reassure you, as an advocate, you don't have to do the labor of building relationships on your own. You have a team and a support system that includes people at your agency, like your director, SART coordinators and managers, victim advocates. So those are also people who are in your corner. And then also you have us. We sincerely mean, you can always reach out to us to have both difficult and easy conversations. That's what we're here for. And not all the partners that we list here are going to be involved all the time, right? But it's important that the work doesn't just sit with one person at the jail or the prison, or even just at your agency. We know that people get promoted, people leave, and we don't want the work to stop when that happens. So it's important to build some kind of team, especially since we know that, not all of our advocacy efforts are going to be housed in one single department. And then something that we just want to note when we're doing systems advocacy, and we can't stress this enough, it helps a lot to have a support system in place. This kind of work, leads to burnout and frustration. I know when we have our advocate meetings, a lot of it is just venting, sharing some of the stressors that are inherent with our work. So having people in your corner that really understand this work and how difficult it can be is really important to help you out when things get tough. And you can also bring different skill sets to the table, right? Your other advocates at your agencies provide something different that can benefit your clients. So, and then again, you can lean on your directors and managers and even us, both JDI and Valor, for some of the bigger picture, the more diplomatic conversations that might be necessary to have. And, we just want to say we're here and we're all in this together. And we mean that very sincerely. Okay. We also just wanted to share some considerations. And I know I'm speeding through this, but we're going to talk about strategies for building successful partnerships in a second. And that part really excites me. So that's why I'm going through this so fast. But we did just want to focus on this very quickly. So we just want to address the elephant in the room, which is this work is not easy, and it's not easy for a number of reasons. For some advocates, building relationships with staff at a facility, it can be super weird. It can be unsettling. Sometimes it's confusing. That's why we put this meme picture here of a woman doing some weird math, because it's hard, right? It can feel like you're compromising your professional and personal values, especially if you have a really deep investment in the safety of your program participants and clients. So we just want to say it's normal to feel this way if you're feeling like that, right? Like having these kinds of conversations with facilities can be really difficult. But at the same time, we know that it's important to remember the core goal of your work, which is to serve and support incarcerated survivors. And when you build a strong professional relationship with corrections, you're in a lot better position to advocate not just for people who participate in your services, but other incarcerated people within the facility. And that's why this work is important. We always say, like, they're not going to listen to you if they don't know you and to some degree trust you. So that's why it's so important to build these kinds of relationships. And then we want to stress, when it feels like you're holding conflicting beliefs or attitudes, that's when we think it's super important to practice self-care. There's this author that I really love, Audre Lorde, and she writes a lot about self-care. And one of the things that she writes is that it isn't an act of self-indulgence. Took me a long time to understand what that means. But she's saying, like, this isn't selfish. This work would be like nearly impossible to do if we don't have real mechanisms to care for ourselves. So that means creating internal spaces at your agency. That means having advocates to process the experiences that you have at the facility or that you have outside of the facility, right? Those are all things that are important. And one thing we want to know is also how you might prepare to see like additional suffering that you may witness, and how you might react or respond to the suffering, especially if you're on site for either a walkthrough or roll through of the facility or when you're providing accompaniment. We know that incarcerated people sit like at the center of a lot of different systems of oppression. And what that means is that you're super likely to hear people being treated inhumanely. Like that's just the nature of this work. And so I think it's super important to talk about how you're going to prepare for that, how you might respond to it, and then how you're going to decompress and process afterwards. So we just want to take a quick moment to talk about that.
Thank you, Yamila. I couldn't have said any of that better myself. So, we are going to talk about some strategies that have worked, and that doesn't mean that they'll always work. I think, like Yamila said, like this work is really challenging. I'm working with corrections folks almost all day, every day, and there have been plenty of times where I've been like, I am not going to email that person. They don't respond to me. Screw them, right? But then I have to sit and think, okay, but what do incarcerated survivors need me to do? Like they kind of need me to let go of that and just keep going, right? And so that's sort of what it motivates me to continue to work with folks that probably don't want to work with me very much. So let's go over some strategies that have worked for us in the past. And a lot of it really depends on where you are in the process of building your relationship. So if you're, just getting started and never sort of worked with a detention facility near you before, half the challenge is just finding the right person to get in touch with. And sometimes that's the PREA coordinator, and sometimes it's really not. It really depends on who that PREA coordinator is or PREA compliance manager. They may know everything, or they may have been someone who was told, oh, you're the PREA coordinator now 2 weeks ago, and they probably, more than they do, right? So a lot of it depends on who you're trying to get in touch with and what your goal is. Are you trying to get in to do in-person services? Are you trying to set up a hotline? Are you trying to reach out about an audit, whatever it is? So if you're starting from scratch, one thing you can do is just look at your facility's website. Sometimes I'm surprised by the kinds of things that you can find on an agency's website, like past reports, audit reports, investigative reports, all kinds of things that you can find just available online. The first few pages of an audit, if you haven't seen an audit report before, I highly recommend that you look one up. Maybe we can slap one in the chat in a moment. The first few pages of an audit contain the warden's name, the PREA coordinator's name, all kinds of contact information. So you should be able to at least find out that information by doing that. Agencies are required to post their PREA audits online, so they should be available. You could just do a simple Google search. It's somewhere to start, right? And even if the PREA contact at the facility has changed, maybe there's a new person right at the same desk that you can still reach out to. Call and find out. I mean, sometimes you just got to make some cold calls and be transferred from one person to the other until you get to the right person. And sometimes that's what it takes, right? But of course, you need to be prepared to either not have the phone be answered, or if you're emailing, to have no one email you back. There have been plenty of times where I've emailed every other day for weeks. And that's what it takes. That's what it takes. That's what I'm willing to do to get folks to respond to me. I will fill up people's inboxes while remaining, polite and kind and professional and all of that. Another option too is to take note of any other programs that are doing work in the facilities, whether it's a religious program or a drug use program or anything like that. There may be other sort of in your nonprofit world that are working in those facilities as well, and they may know some folks. They may even know the right folks to work with you all. So if you're reaching out to corrections agency, another thing to sort of consider is professional norms, right? I think in the advocacy world, we sort of have our way of interacting with each other and the norms that we consider, when we're interacting with each other. And in corrections, those norms can be entirely different. So I'm very verbose. I talk a lot and I tend to write a lot. And one of the first lessons I learned pretty early on was they are not going to read my emails if it's more than just a couple sentences. It's just not going to happen. So I've really practiced the ability to condense 17 questions into 1 or 2, right? A lot of it is about prioritizing. A lot of it is just being concise and being really direct, being really clear about what you're asking for. Emailing is not a really common sort of way of communicating in corrections. It's an entirely different sort of world. So they may not have the same sort of email communication expectations that we might have out here, because email may be sort of really normal for us. I can't say enough to document your attempts, right? So if you say, oh, I called 3 times, it doesn't mean anything unless you can say, I called on this date and I called on this date and I called on this date, right? That's so much more powerful than saying, oh, I've been trying to reach out, right? So just have a place where you're sort of documenting how many times, who you reached out to, whether you heard back or not, all of that. And remember, as always, your agency is in a really unique position to help facilities with their PREA compliance. And so I don't want you all to feel like you're sort of without any leverage, because you are, right? You do have that sort of ability to be like, I'm here to help you, right? It's not always going to be received that way, but at the end of the day, you are really in a place to be able to help them do the stuff that they're supposed to do. We can move to the, thank you. So some of these initial conversations that you have with corrections are really, really, really important. They're good for building trust, for building rapport, and to learn about each other. I think the other thing that I learned really, really quickly is that I know nothing about corrections, or at least I didn't when I first started working, right? And they probably don't know anything about you or about advocacy or about what your role is or about sexual abuse or about any of the stuff that you all are really experts in. So there's a lot of like question asking and answering, a lot of, what do you do? This is what I do. What do you do with, all those kinds of conversations are really important. Scheduling a walkthrough or a tour, you might call it, is typically one of those sort of first things that happens when you're meeting, with a new facility. And these are also a really good opportunity to be strategic. So if you're going on a tour or a walkthrough, take a moment before you go to think about, okay, what are your goals? Who do you want to talk to? Who do you want to, what places in the facility do you want to visit? There's a walkthrough checklist that Marcella just posted into the chat that can be really, really helpful. The last thing that you want is to go to this, go to a tour and meet with a lot of people and then leave with nothing, right? So you want to make sure that you're getting contact information, that you're scheduling meetings before you walk out, so that you're making the best of every sort of opportunity you have to meet with folks. First impressions mean a lot, right? So you want to think about who's going into that facility. We know that corrections is really, I'm going to mess up this word, hierarchical. They're based in hierarchy, right? And so a lot of times for them, having someone who's at a really high position is going to be more meaningful than having someone who isn't in a really high position. And that might feel a little weird to us, because I don't think that's really how many advocates are used to thinking about these kinds of relationships. But in corrections, rank means a lot. And so having sort of your ED or a manager, a director, or somebody kind of be a part of those initial conversations demonstrates to them like, oh, this is important, like they're taking this really seriously. So you want to make sure that you're really comfortable talking about the program in case they ask questions. You want to make sure that you are considering what kinds of questions they might even ask, right? So you can come with the answers. Another thing to consider as well is making sure that you're talking about your shared goal, right? Earlier, Yanila was talking about compromising your personal or professional values. And that is something that's in my mind a lot when I'm working with corrections, right? Like, am I being buddy-buddy with folks who are, you know, emblematic of all of the issues that we're seeing? And again, I think about, okay, what do incarcerated survivors need from me, right? That means I got to joke around with, you know, Joe officer over here and smile and whatever, then I'll do it, right? If that means that he's more likely to pick up the phone next time I call, right? In the end, we both want the same thing though. Advocates, officers, we want the facilities to be safer. That's what we all want. And so coming back to that reality, you know, making sure that you're always talking about that shared goal, even if you all have different ways of getting there or different focuses, different priorities, the end goal is always going to be the same. And I think making sure that you're, you know, really talking about that and being very clear about that is really, really helpful. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as your good rapport opens doors, who doesn't love a good rhyme? So as you're developing those initial relationships, think about how you can build on top of that, right? Are you scheduling regular meetings, quarterly meetings, for example, with folks from your facility? Are you maybe talking about doing training opportunities? Are you sharing resources with them? That's another good way to sort of reach out to folks if you need an excuse to reach out. You know, send them a webinar recording or send them some resource you found or what have you. You know, corrections is all about safety, all about maintaining order. You know, and so the more that you can talk about how your services and your presence makes facilities safer, the more you can talk about how focused on safety you are as well, can help, you know, bridge that language gap, if you will. You know, your presence is making their jobs easier, and sometimes you gotta, you know, convince them a little bit that that's the case. And you also sometimes gotta convince them that, you know, about your intentions, right? That you're there to help them, you're there to help survivors, you're not there to cause problems or, you know, make the facility less safe. That is the exact opposite of what you want to do. But, you know, I think there's a couple points that are important here. By providing trauma-informed services, your work has the potential to make a difference if the folks that officers are dealing with are maybe less likely to have really intense trauma reactions, right? Because of the work that you're doing with them. Secondly, to provide access to your services as a rape crisis center obviously helps them pass their audits, right? And that's something that's really important as well. Marcella, I'm gonna pass things off to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And I really can't understate how important it is for you to know how to talk about your services and how beneficial they are to their facility in a very humble manner, right? So being able to talk about how trauma responses will be reduced if folks are offered services that you know, oftentimes the symptoms they're experiencing go unaddressed if you don't go in and provide those services and support. So really focus on your work rather than in some ways kind of pointing out the flaws in the way that they do their work, and really be able to model that. Not that we don't want to hold people accountable, right? And so I think this is where balancing your goals and their comfort zones sometimes is really important. I know that all of us here are so passionate about this work. We often walk into these partnerships with a long list of amazing ideas that we want to be able to implement, questions that we want to ask about their last audit, or goals that we have as an agency that is really invested in providing services to survivors, right? And so before we start asking for a lot, we want to be able to build trust and rapport, because I know it can scare folks off to be kind of firing off at all cylinders, asking lots of questions, asking for different services to become confidential if they aren't already. And so I think many of us have already sort of alluded to this, that being able to prioritize what we're asking for and really centering the needs of survivors is going to be really important when you're making those asks, when you're building that trust, when you've just met someone from the facility. So I think that each relationship is really unique and nuanced. You might need to start off slower, and sometimes some contact is better than no contact. But really, like we've all said, the stronger rapport you can build with your allies and the more people you have on your team, both on the rape crisis center side and the correction side, the better you are able to reach survivors and provide those services. So just a couple tips in terms of connecting with correction staff. We want to acknowledge you may face subtle or blatant hesitation, and it can be really helpful to recognize when to push on some of those things and when to fall back. So I know that many of us are very well read in reading body language from working with survivors and kind of assessing how are they reading the situation, whether it's at a forensic exam. But those same skills are really helpful when you're meeting, especially in person, you can see the corrections officers' body language. You can see people kind of leaning back into their chair, or like their whole body is sort of widespread. Perhaps they're unaware of how much space they're taking up. Maybe they have their arms crossed. And, we don't always want to assume that that's something that implies hesitation, but we can keep that in the back of our minds. Like, okay, maybe they're not hearing what I'm saying in the way that I'm saying it, right? So finding new ways of explaining and advocating for trauma-informed care or confidentiality when you're kind of noticing that it's not resonating or it's not being received well, and kind of shifting the way that you're communicating can be really helpful. And then also just common verbal and written cues for folks that maybe aren't meeting with people in person quite just yet, but maybe you're getting an email every once in a while, or you're getting a phone call in every once in a while, being really mindful of how they're engaging in that conversation. I know sometimes we can tell with advocates I've worked with for 2 or 3 years, they'll tell me, when we're working closely with them to build a relationship, that I can tell this person's really only talking to me because they want to pat themselves on the back and get some validation for the work that they're doing. Sometimes folks are really dismissive about the reports that incarcerated folks are making, or they might say, we investigate every allegation and only a handful or 0 have been substantiated. And so sometimes that's an indicator of the culture of the facility and how systemically their facility is responding to reports, how they're pushing investigations forward, whether or not they're calling advocates to attend investigatory interviews or forensic exams. So those are things that you notice quickly, and you can speak to your manager and maybe bring them in to support you when you're having these conversations, and role play with us as well in terms of how to respond in a way that that is still kind, because at the end of the day, our goal is to maintain relationships with correctional facilities so that we can provide the services that we provide. So I'm sure many other people can think of other sort of verbal cues that have said that have allowed them to notice things aren't being taken seriously, and think about how we can respond to those situations and educate folks. I know we've said a lot of about the challenges and how to respond to those challenges, but I think it's also incredibly important to also celebrate their efforts. Even if for us it feels like that was not enough. We've been trying to do this for months or years, and now we're finally getting something that we're asking for. But we do want to celebrate those efforts, right? So that those things continue to happen. And also just showing sympathy for corrections officers who often are overworked and often are underpaid, and really be able to express that gratitude. I know we all can sort of empathize with being understaffed, with being underpaid. And so being able to empathize with them and let them know that you recognize their challenges as well, in the same way that, oftentimes it doesn't feel good to be asked a bunch of things and then not recognize the effort that we're putting in, or not recognize how much our workload is really impacting our mental health. So extending that grace to them as well at the same time that we're continuing to call, as Jessica said, continuing to follow up with empathy and with that sympathy as well. So I'm going to move forward. I have a couple more things that I know I want to cover in terms of sustainability and self-care. I think that, we also really want to acknowledge both the weight and privilege of doing this work. It can feel overwhelming and oftentimes performative. I know we've used that word a lot lately to really recognize it. Sometimes it doesn't feel good to be friendly with people that maybe have not sustained our relationship in the way that we had hoped for it to be sustained. So it's not uncommon to feel guilt or confusion. It's not uncommon to feel like you're sort of betraying your values as an advocate and activist. So really remember, that we aren't here to become enmeshed in the system. We're not here to placate to what corrections is saying about survivors. We're not here to agree with what they're saying at all. We're here to educate. We're here to provide our own unique position and to leverage our knowledge and expertise to provide services to survivors behind bars. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but coming face to face with oppressive systems, the normalization of dehumanization and suffering can be incredibly triggering for all of us. And it's completely normal. And it's important to have some tools and coping mechanisms in our back pocket because it can be really helpful, right? When you're in a facility, it can be really shocking to your nervous system, and it can put you in a really heightened state. And so, navigating multiple locked doors and slammed gates and getting stared at by corrections staff and being sort of herded from place to place can be uncomfortable. And oftentimes, not oftentimes, but we're also sort of seeing how incarcerated folks are being treated themselves. And so we're seeing a very small factor of what people are experiencing. And so one of the ways we can combat this is by grounding ourselves before we enter the facility and afterwards, right? And so maybe you call an advocate that's also staffed at your organization. Maybe you call a friend to get your mind off of what just happened, to sort of be able to, in some ways, sort of like create a boundary between you and the facility afterwards. I think that sometimes we bring all of those feelings into our homes, back into the agency that we're working in. And so how can we come back to center, come back to ourselves, go for a walk, get a cup of coffee, really do any kind of body scan or meditation to, again, center yourself back into your own body. This isn't to sort of brush off that experience either. We want to keep that awareness and understanding of how people feel, but we don't want to carry it with us. It's kind of like, let's put it in a container for when it's not useful to us and then bring it back out when it's necessary. And, again, also checking in with your supervisor, be honest about what you're experiencing. Maybe word has spread at the facility and you're receiving a lot of referrals now. And on one hand, that's something to be celebrated. And on the other hand, it can also be really overwhelming. You're going from a place where perhaps your relationship wasn't super strong and people weren't reaching out. And now people are starting to reach out and provide services. So be honest with your supervisor again, if there is a need for another advocate to support you with services. And it's a wonderful reminder to make sure that your entire staff is trained on how to work with incarcerated folks. You don't want to be the sole person who is holding this sort of overwhelming feeling. It's really all of our responsibilities to be able to participate and to provide these services. So I will also just end on the note of being able to process your feelings, right? And so not pushing them away, not obviously not, keeping that to yourself can be really harmful. And we also want to have a balance of, we're not showing that to our participants, we're not showing it to survivors unless it's something that they're venting with you and you want to sort of mirror those feelings, but really being mindful of who we're processing with is important too. So we're also going to get into some of the key patterns, some of the common scenarios that we've seen when in terms of working with advocates. And if you had registered for this webinar prior to yesterday, you probably already received these scenarios. And I will also drop a Google Doc in the chat, which I just realized you may not be able to click on it if I didn't change the settings, and I likely did not. So let me just make sure that folks can access this regardless of whether you have. Okay, anyone with the link can check and read that. So those are the scenarios. Let me get to the next slide so we can look at them. So first scenario, and if you have experienced this before, please raise your hand, whether it's like using your actual hand or with the emojis, drop a line in the chat. Let us know if this is something you've experienced before. And so it says, you find out a report was made 2 days ago and staff did not reach out to you to support the survivor. When you ask why, the staff says that it wasn't a real PREA case, quote unquote. The guy was definitely lying. Plus, I know you're super busy. I'm seeing some nodding of heads. That must mean you've probably heard this before. Like I said, please raise your hand if this is something that you're familiar with. And let's get into asking a couple questions. Let me know what you think is challenging about this situation, how you would feel if you heard this, and what you would like to say or do. And I say like to say or do because I think what we feel in concert with what we'd like to say doesn't always, that's not always the first thing we end up saying, right? We've got to process that and then edit our own words. I know I do sometimes. As Yamila and Jenica and Jessica and I were working through this scenario, the three of us were like, this is what I want to say, and this is what I actually end up saying. So feel free to unmute yourself or drop a line in the chat about what's challenging about this situation and how it might make you feel and what you'd like to say. And we can speak freely here. I'll wait for folks to, again, process your feelings because we did advocate for that in the last slide. So let us know how would this make you feel? Maria, go for it. And you're muted, just so you know. I can see you talking, but you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I actually experienced this, not the last part of the sentence there, but I frequently have where someone's reported a PREA case, but they don't notify us, and the person has asked for advocate to be present. I usually follow up with my manager. My manager follows up with the PREA in custody coordinator that does a report. And it just seems like we are not being called out when they're asking for an advocate. And it's very frustrating because when I meet with the client, they feel like they're not really being heard and taken serious when they're making the report. And they feel like they don't know what's the next step. And so they reach out to us. And by the time they reach out to us, we find out we weren't present. I think the other part of this about being super busy, that's a judgment they're making. It's regardless, they should have reached out anyways. Because if I wasn't able to, someone in the team would have been able to as well. Yeah.
And Maria, how would this make you feel? Because I know you mentioned how the survivor felt, and that is important.
Yeah, no, I actually, when I check in with my manager, I'm very mad and frustrated. I just feel like there's this disconnect with, as much as we try to build those bridges and relationships with the jail staff. For some reason, the PREA reporter, for some reason, we're just not getting the information when we request, or when, yeah, so it's pretty upsetting. I get really frustrated. It's really hard. For me, I just don't understand why they cannot call us. I don't get it. I don't understand that part. And it just, most of our PREA cases are unfounded, and I want to know why. And I ask more questions, follow-up questions, and we just don't get the answers. And I feel like we have this big wall we're hitting and can't get past it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for going first and sharing your feelings. I know typically we will not ask about how does this make you feel, but I think that it's important to hold space for frustrations. And I'm seeing also in the chat sort of reflecting what you're saying in terms of, I didn't contact you for your own good. I've got your best interest at heart. And Jessica saying it's really patronizing to have a decision made for you about your own job and your own role in the system. So Maria, I heard you say, what would be some next steps? Reaching out to the PREA coordinator, getting a sense of why you were not called. And so that's sort of like in the short term, right? And some of the individual advocacy that we mentioned in the beginning in terms of advocating for that particular survivor. But I'm also hearing the concern that this could be a systemic problem. What could this mean for survivors in the past and survivors in the future that may experience that? And so something that we can do when we're talking to the PREA coordinator is talk about a community coordinated response, talk about how can we integrate our rape crisis center into those responses, so that I think oftentimes we see that the only people that are involved in that response is corrections. And so how can we integrate ourselves into, I was going to say day-to-day responses, but typically this is not a day-to-day thing, but we do want to be able to institutionalize ourselves into that response, right? And so making sure perhaps that you're not only are you being called, but you're part of that planning meeting. You're part of problem solving with them. And I don't say that to make it seem like it's an easy ask, right? You can continue to ask to be part of those conversations and those meetings and still not be heard, but I would highly, highly recommend to continue advocating for that when you're connecting with a PREA coordinator. Maybe you're connecting with the warden or the facility administrator, whatever the title may be. And I know that oftentimes the PREA coordinator doesn't have a lot of power within that hierarchy. And so how can you integrate someone higher up from that system so that the chain of command is highly aware of what's going on, rather than just one person who may not feel responsible for changing the system. And so how can we have conversations with many, many people so that multiple people are aware of the problem and become responsible for changing what's going on in the system. I'm seeing my team kind of nodding their heads. So feel free to add anything that I didn't say.
I just want to highlight what Pamela said in the chat, which is Pamela says, like, as hard as it is, but telling the officer it's not our place to decide what is or isn't sexual assault, keeping our biases in check and letting forensics assess what happened. Like, you're right, like, we're not, advocates are not in charge of investigating anything. And there are like designated people at the facility who conduct investigations. Is likely not the person who talked to you about a 2-day investigation. So I know Jessica had more to say on that, but I just wanted to briefly uplift Pamela's comment.
Oh yeah, I just says here that the report was made 2 days ago, and you already know that it's not a real case. like you typically do investigations in 2 days. That's what I would want to say. But I'm going to say it a little bit differently. And I think this is one of those areas where, as much as I hate to admit it, I will play dumb. And I'll say, wow, 2 days? Like, are you typically able to do investigations in that amount of time? Just to kind of put them a little, kind of forces them to explain themselves a little bit, just by being curious and being like, I don't know, is that typical? And it's not, but it kind of puts them in a position where, it's like, how do you argue your way out of that one? Because typically investigations do not take 2 days.
Yeah, and I think just also reiterating to corrections that when an investigation happens really quickly and the survivor is not involved in the investigation and advocates not involved in this situation, there's not a lot of transparency. And when a survivor hears it was unfounded or it was unsubstantiated and they were not called, that feels really invalidating. That makes it feel like nothing was taken seriously. They were not believed. And so as advocates, it's really important for us to be able to understand how this happened so that we can provide more clarity and transparency to the survivor that we're working with. Because it's at the end of the day, this isn't something that they experienced and they were sort of marginalized in that experience once again. So if they want to make sure that people are feeling safe in their facility, there needs to be a lot of transparency about how that conclusion was made. And so, yeah, I will move into the next scenario. And unfortunately, I anticipate other folks may have experienced something like this as well. And so I'll read it right now. As you enter the facility, you and a correctional officer joke about last night's basketball game. When you meet with your client, they share that they feel uncomfortable sharing with you because you seem too friendly with staff at the facility. They worry that you will let staff know about their situation. So again, we want to know what is challenging about this situation. And I think we've alluded to this a lot in the presentation. And how would you feel if you heard this from one of the survivors that you've been working with? And again, feel free to unmute yourself or drop a line in the chat for us and take some time to think about what's challenging about this situation and how do you feel? How would you feel if you heard this? Allison, go for it.
I think initially, I would just want to thank the individual for saying that, because it says a lot for them to speak up and share their voice about how this made them feel. And, sometimes that can be very hard for them if they feel like they're in a suppressed environment. And so I would just acknowledge, I really appreciate you sharing with me how this made you feel, and then convey, not to diminish how they feel, but again, the difference in the relationship that again, this is the relationship I have with them, but again, I want you to know when it means to come into this facility, I'm coming here for you and solely you in itself, and to focus on you. And I hope, with me chatting about this, again, wasn't a way of communicating rapport and connection community-wise, to help almost better assist with their needs, but also in no way does I want it to take away from how they feel.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that you started off by thanking them, because I think when someone sets a boundary with you, or they convey that they felt not so great about a situation that they witnessed you participating in, that's them feeling comfortable to in some ways hold you accountable or let you know this didn't feel right to me. And so it's an opportunity for us to repair their trust in us and our services. And again, reinforce everything that you share with me is confidential unless you want me to share it with other folks. And so really centering that, and then reminding them, if I don't have a relationship, it does become really difficult to come here and to provide the services that we provide. Yeah. Any other thoughts on how folks would respond or maybe feel at first? Amber, I'm reading your comment here that says, because you want to build or maintain a relationship, and the comment is couched as a joke, sometimes that makes it harder to treat it as an opportunity to educate. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Amber?
Sure. This reminds me of when we first started working with law enforcement, because the dynamics were not that different. And we had no relationship. And when we did start having relationships, they were very adversarial. And so all of those things that you talked about in terms of, am I selling out? And I'm speaking the truth and you're just you're just babbling your mandates. It is really a hard relationship to build. And it seems like you have to have a microscope on all of your interactions initially, because even the slightest one-off can deter that relationship from being maintained or even started, right? Because a lot of advocates, we've had the reputation of, oh, you have no sense of humor. And so you just, it's a constant. We used to talk about it when we were doing visits to the correctional facility here in Las Vegas, and it was every week we went to do a group, it was like a sellout. It's what you did. If you felt like you were selling out initially, at least the facilitator and I, that we were doing that, we were like, okay, take a deep breath. And then there's always ice cream afterwards, right?
Yeah, I would say, I want to offer like a paradigm shift that we are not selling out, we're shape-shifting when it's necessary, and I think that, we're only selling out when we are selling survivors out by, if we are enmeshed and it gets to the point where correctional officers are like, well, we're buddy now. Why don't you tell me that story that survivor just shared with you? That let's be realistic. That is selling out. But shape-shifting is being able to have a relationship, understand where they're coming from, and still prioritizing the needs of survivors. So hopefully that helps in terms of like the guilt and the confusion that we often feel.
Oh yeah. And I think if you hang with it long enough, you realize that there are a lot of people who are working in corrections who, while they may not be able to articulate it, feel in many ways the same as you do in terms of professionalism and why they're doing the work, or so yeah, if you can build that relationship to get to that point, it makes it so much easier. It makes it so much easier, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think finding the right people, right? I think that you can plant a seed and connect with many different people and see who sort of internalizes what we're sharing with them about trauma-informed care and the need for our services.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you, Amber, for bringing up the sort of journey that you've been on. We do have another scenario to share, and we won't be able to get too much into it. I just want to acknowledge that this is an experience that many folks have in terms of letter writing. A few survivors have written that the facility is opening and reading your letters to them. They worry that the staff, knowing about their abuse, will cause them to retaliate against them. So I know we've received a lot of TA calls about this particular situation, and it's just like the others, this is a systemic problem. Maybe you've already put confidential communication into your MOU and it's just not being respected. And this is an opportunity for us to talk to the PREA coordinator and offer our training, offer a poster that indicates which organizations are to be respected as privileged communicators with survivors. And I really can't understate how important it is that survivors are the ones that are noticing this first, and they're the ones that feel comfortable telling you things are not being respected here in terms of confidential communication. So apologies because I didn't even get a time to answer folks' questions. I can stay on a little bit longer to see if folks have any follow-up. I see some folks need to log off. Totally fine. Thank you for joining us. And spending some time with some of the challenging experiences I know many of you all have. So yes, any questions, And as if folks are thinking about questions, I'll just offer up our technical assistants. Jenica, Yamila, Jessica, and myself are all available for support. And so my team, if you're able to, please feel free to drop your emails in the chat and reach out to us. If you email one of us, you're emailing really all of us. And just a couple other resources, the Valor website, the Just Detention International website, and of course the PREA Resource Center. So highly recommend utilizing those resources on there. No questions I see. So thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day.